Miss Thelma stepped onto the plane with quiet grace, her steps slow and measured, supported by a polished wooden cane. She held an old photo gently in one hand, a black and white image of a much younger version of herself in a crisp military uniform. Her eyes, though tired with age, still carried the weight of memory and purpose. As she made her way through the cabin, some passengers glanced at her with curiosity, noting her worn coat and the quiet dignity she carried. She reached her assigned seat in first class, paused, and began to lower her small carry-on when a young flight attendant appeared beside her. The attendant's expression tightened with doubt, and her tone was more dismissive than polite. "I think you're in the wrong section, ma'am. First class is for priority passengers," she said, as if stating a rule Miss Thelma should have known better than to challenge. The moment froze in place. A few passengers turned their heads, a couple of them frowning, others whispering behind hands. Miss Thelma said nothing. She didn't argue or explain. Instead, she simply nodded, her eyes lowering not out of shame, but with the weight of someone who had endured far worse. She turned and began to shuffle down the aisle toward coach, the photo now tucked carefully against her chest. No one stopped her. No one stood up. No one questioned the assumption that she didn't belong. And as the sound of murmurs trailed behind her, Miss Thelma moved forward, silent, strong, and unknowingly about to become the reason an entire plane full of strangers would never see dignity the same way again. Miss Thelma had only made it a few steps toward the back when a commanding voice broke through the cabin speakers. "This is your captain speaking. Everyone please remain seated." The usual hum of pre-flight chatter faded instantly. Heads turned. Even the flight attendants paused mid-task. The cockpit door swung open, and out stepped the pilot, tall, composed, and unmistakably military in bearing, his uniform crisp, his medals subtle but present. He walked with purpose down the aisle, his eyes fixed on Miss Thelma. The cabin was silent, breathless. Passengers leaned into the moment, unsure of what was happening but sensing its weight. Reaching her, he gently touched her arm and held up the photo she had been clutching moments ago, now slightly bent but still proudly showing her younger self in uniform. "Ma'am, is this you?" Miss Thelma blinked, startled, her lips parting just slightly as she gave a small, uncertain nod. The pilot stared at the photo for another beat, then back at her. Around them, the silence deepened. Passengers craned their necks, eyes wide. The tension from earlier hadn't just broken, it had shifted, thickened into something electric, waiting to crack open into revelation. The young flight attendant from before watched from a few rows away, her expression unreadable. Miss Thelma stood quietly, still holding her cane, unsure what was about to happen. But something had changed. The shame pressed onto her moments ago was now met with the gaze of a man who clearly saw something else, something far more valuable than status or a first-class ticket. In that quiet, suspended moment, a new truth was about to be spoken aloud, and no one on that flight would leave the same. The pilot turned slowly to face the stunned passengers, his voice firm but reverent as he addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, lifting the photo slightly for all to see, "this woman is Lieutenant Thelma Jenkins. One of the first black female officers in the United States Air Force." A wave of murmurs rolled through the cabin, growing into audible gasps as he continued. "She flew missions during a time when women like her weren't just told they didn't belong in uniform. They couldn't even eat in the same restaurants as their fellow soldiers. She served this country with honor, dignity, and courage, long before many of us were even born." The passengers sat motionless, their expressions shifting from confusion to awe. Some blinked back tears. Others simply stared at the woman they had watched moments earlier being dismissed. Miss Thelma stood frozen in the aisle, cane in one hand, the other pressed gently to her heart. Her lip trembled. She hadn't expected this. Not the attention. Not the recognition. Not after all these years of quietly living in the background. She had boarded this flight just another elderly woman, invisible to most. Now, the truth of her past had taken flight, rising above years of silence and erasure. And in that moment, the weight of all she had carried, her service, her sacrifices, the injustice she'd endured, was no longer hidden. Her eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of something deeper. Something that felt like honor finally acknowledged. History finally remembered. She stood a little taller as the plane, and everyone on it, held its breath. The pilot took a step back, his posture straightening. Without a hint of hesitation, he brought his hand to his brow in a crisp, precise salute. The gesture, so full of meaning, caught like a spark in the silence. "You paved the runway for people like me, ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "First class doesn't even begin to cover the seat you deserve." Miss Thelma's lips quivered, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. Her eyes shimmered with tears, and her hand trembled as she returned the salute, slower, softer, but no less powerful. A hush swept through the cabin like wind before a storm, and then, one by one, passengers began to rise. Row after row, people stood to their feet, a standing ovation growing with each clap. Applause thundered through the narrow cabin. Some cried openly. Others stood solemnly, hands over hearts. The flight attendant who had questioned Miss Thelma's place in first class stood frozen at her post. Her head slowly bowed, shame rising like heat in her cheeks. The pilot gently offered his arm, and Miss Thelma, still overwhelmed, accepted it with grace. Together, they walked back up the aisle, not in silence this time, but through waves of applause and whispered thanks. This wasn't just a walk back to a seat, it was a walk into recognition, into history made visible. He helped her ease into her first-class seat, this time with reverence in every motion. He didn't rush. He didn't look away. He honored her the way the world should have, long ago. And as she settled in, the applause slowly faded, but the moment stayed, suspended in the hearts of every soul on board. The engines hummed to life as the plane began to taxi down the runway, a low, steady roar rising beneath the floor. Miss Thelma sat quietly by the window, her hands folded over the worn photo resting in her lap. Outside, clouds drifted like soft memories. Inside, the echoes of applause still lingered, not in sound, but in the warmth that now filled the cabin. She looked out into the sky, eyes tracing the horizon, not just seeing it but remembering all the barriers she'd once flown through. The uniform. The stairs. The loneliness. And the strength it took to rise above it all. Across the aisle, a teenage girl with curly hair and wide, curious eyes leaned over, voice soft and sincere. "Thank you, for everything." Miss Thelma turned, her smile slow and knowing. She studied the girl's face, the kind of face that, once upon a time, might never have been allowed on a plane, let alone flying freely beside her. Her voice came gently, like a breeze through tall grass. "Just did what was right. Like he did today." The girl nodded, blinking back tears. The moment passed between them like a torch. As the wheels lifted from the ground, the aircraft soared into the sky, but what rose with it was something greater, a quiet truth carried by every soul on board. That dignity does not fade with age, nor is it granted by a seat number. It is earned, lived, and, when recognized, lifts us all a little higher. The world outside the plane grew smaller, but something inside everyone had grown. A simple flight had become a story, a soaring testament to courage, gratitude, and the unshakable spirit of humanity. Conclusion. This story, though born from a simple moment on a plane, becomes something far greater, a mirror reflecting the deep human need for recognition, respect, and connection. Miss Thelma's quiet strength, forged through decades of sacrifice and perseverance, collides with modern indifference in a way that shakes an entire plane awake. What began as yet another instance of being overlooked transforms into a moment of collective clarity, where one man's choice to see her reshapes the hearts of many. Through the captain's unexpected act of honor, the passengers are reminded that dignity has nothing to do with status, age, or appearance. It lives in the stories people carry, in the roads they've paved for others. Miss Thelma didn't need applause, but in receiving it, something was restored, not just for her, but for every witness on board. In an age where division often speaks louder than kindness, this story stands as a quiet anthem for the power of humanity. It shows how one act of courage, one moment of standing up for what's right, can change the atmosphere in a room, or in this case, 30,000 feet above the ground. Let it remind us, every seat holds a story. Every face holds a history. And sometimes, honoring one life lifts us all.